We're going to go ahead and get going. We'll start with item 1.1, review of this evening's agenda. Are there any items we need to make adjustments to? Okay, seeing none. Future agenda items, any agenda items that council would like to see on a future agenda?
I was going to tell you, at one of the classes I took talked a lot about the innovation and things like that happened during COVID. Ideas that people came up with and things. I thought it might be cool if you maybe even we highlighted those over a few council meetings or something like that, so the public understands some of the innovative ways that our staff and people here at the city kind of came up with different solutions to make, anyway, I just thought he talked a ton about investing in people. And I thought, oh, that's a great idea, maybe to highlight, there's certainly a lot of people who had to change things up or do things differently. We even talked a couple weeks ago about the space out at the Public Works and how it's had to get tricky. And, I just like that they're trying always different innovative ways to make things work. So I thought it might be nice just to show our investment in people if we highlight some of that. Thank you.
We have a few from staff. We have encroachment on city property. This continues to be an issue that comes to us, and we'd like some more direction. I know you've given us direction in the past about some certain properties, but as Chase and Jonathan and some other staff and I have gone through some of these, we have some we'd like to bring back to staff or to council. So you'll be seeing that coming up soon. Bonneville Research will be here to present their findings on the annexation area on May 26th. So we'll be looking forward to that. And one thing that's not a future agenda item, but I just need a little bit of direction on, is the Salt Lake Community College groundbreaking is looking for a speaker for that groundbreaking on July 15th at 9 a.m. That is Jared's month to report out. So I'm not sure if he's available or not. I was hoping to catch him this evening to see. I don't know if there's any feedback on that.
I'd say, since it's his month, start with him, and then we can go to the rest of the council after that.
So
Well, an arm wrestle, and whoever wins doesn't have to do it.
Okay. We'll plan on July 15th at 9 a.m. to attend that groundbreaking. I will be in Lake Powell. So it was a groundbreaking or a divorce, and I had to weigh that out, but I'll go to Lake Powell.
It's interesting.
Good
I know what
choice.
my wife would choose.
All right, any other items? Okay, any items we need to discuss on the leadership task list that needs to be brought up? Okay.
Mayor, if I know one thing that we've had on there and we talked about a little while ago was reaching out to somebody in particular, was kind of funneling through me to someone in Draper to come and talk to us about, I guess, some of the processes that they have, been through in terms of dealing with auto dealerships. Tamara reached out to me again last week to do some follow-up, so I'm still working on that, but one of the things that maybe we're looking at, because schedules are tight, budget season here, obviously, all of those things, is maybe just trying to get them to do like a white paper for us that kind of talks about some of the highlights for that. So I know that's something that's been on the list for a little bit, but I'm going to try and help facilitate getting that out, at least more information for the council to understand what it takes to really kind of go through a process with the auto dealership. So.
Thank you.
Hey, Mayor, can I-
Yes.
This is kind of going back a step, but one of the big emphasis was to make sure that we're reaching out to our legislators, and we schedule things once a year. I was wondering if we should be scheduling things more like once a quarter, because there's so much that goes on in the interim, so much more that goes on in the interim really than even goes on. And it seems like we get really rushed to try and meet with them right before. So if we could maybe schedule it to where we could be interacting with them once a quarter, I think that would be really advantageous.
I'll talk to Tammy about that.
Perfect, thank
Try to
you.
get that set up. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just to add on what Sherry said there, I think obviously having some interaction at the council level, but sometimes I know with scheduling that's hard to do. That may even just be, extending the offer for them to come and address us like Representative Perucci did not that long ago, but letting them know that that's really kind of we're extending the invitation, but there really kind of is a standing invitation that they know that that's an option for them to come and be able to address us. And I think that it's a good forum to do that. So obviously in a public meeting that the public gets to hear what their legislators are doing, you know, in our area as well. So however we can facilitate that better access, but I think again, that may just be, could be maybe as easy as just saying, do you want to come to our meeting and take 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever it is.
I think with Representative Ritchie's role in the redistricting, I think it would be good to have some communication with her advocating for a more, we don't need 7 different people representing Harriman, right? It would be great to have somebody who represents Harriman specifically, not
Whose primary representation is
primary
Harriman,
representation is Harriman, not just a piece of Harriman, right?
not 6 different pieces of Harriman are represented.
That's exactly my point, yeah.
Anything else?
Okay. Just guys, in regards to that, Lori, Councilman Stringham from the county council has reached out to me and has asked if she can come out. So I've already talked with staff, and they're going to schedule that for a work meeting for her to come out and speak with us and get to know us. She's sounds like she's going to be a great partner for the West Side and wants to help make sure that we're getting what we need and represented fairly on the county level. So, any other items? Okay, we will move on to item 2.1, discussion of proposed amendments to the engineering standards. Jonathan.
Thanks, Jonathan. Okay, so what I thought I would do is, everyone knows I really enjoy talking about standards. So we've been talking about them for a little while, since February, and I thought what I would first do is, kind of, it seems a little backwards, but first just wanted to start here, actually, with, you know, are there any looming questions or concerns, kind of starting there, that maybe I haven't addressed that we haven't talked about yet? And I would start, and I'm not saying that we may necessarily answer it right away, but anyway, any thoughts from?
I want to hear what you have first.
I've got one item to talk about. But aside from that, is there anything that this group has you guys want to hit on? You look excited, Mayor.
I have.
I don't want to slow this down. You're just.
I want to hear.
I'm just going to tell you that just your lead into this and talking about how much you love talking about standards, this image that popped into my head is you with a big S on your chest. And I think we need it. Standards man.
I can condone that. That's pretty.
And I think that would help us if you could maybe incorporate that somehow.
Or next time you do standards, just have Heidi do the presentation.
Right.
We'll all be.
Anytime there's a question on standards, just have a photo booth ready for me to change clothes.
That's right.
Okay, cool. All right, well, we'll jump right in. All right, so we talked about this a few councils' work meetings past, and it was expressed that we bring this back and talk about this a little bit more. So currently in the standard, it states in 4.05.05 that private roadways essentially conform to the standard cross-section of the Harriman standard as well, whether it's public or private. Let's see here, and then we have, for emergency vehicular purposes, all residential units shall be accessible and addressed off of a roadway that conforms to the city roadway cross-section. And obviously that emphasis is added. Now, the proposal here, whoops, maybe I hit that twice. We're already past the proposal.
That was fast.
The proposed adjustment to the standard is maintaining that the public streets conform to the way the standards have been proposed and you've seen in the packet, but rather allowing for private roadway cross-sections we have minimum cross-section requirements and element requirements, but that essentially include A, B, C, or D, or all of those rather, which is include a minimum drivable width of 26 feet, and then conformance with the IFC, the International Fire Code, and then including a separate designated and paved pedestrian walkway to all dwelling structures along the roadway. And then the total corridor width to be dedicated for vehicular and pedestrian traffic shall conform to the minimum 53 feet wide, which is the corridor width minimum requirement for the standard, Harriman City standard. That is from back walk to back walk. So they would essentially dedicate, regardless of what they have in that 53 feet, they would still need to dedicate, not to Harriman City, but at least as the corridor easement width, if that makes sense,
So it'd have to be an easement.
essentially.
And that last part is important. If you remember, a couple of weeks ago, I had Jackie send out a memo that I had finished on HOA disbandment process, right? And road widths was one of the things that we looked at in determining whether a city would even consider accepting previously private property, right? If you're preserving that corridor, you can require them to bring that up to the city standard before they transfer it to the city, if the city, in the end, decides to accept it.
I don't know if this is the right time, but,
Yeah.
just because I know on McQuiston, we changed it, we modified it.
Yes.
Not because it wasn't exactly, but to try and conform with what was there and try to make it least impactful. This still allows that same appeal to the council to make changes. It's not hardwired that we can never make changes, right?
Correct.
No, that's my only concern, is just to make sure that we're still,
Requiring
obviously,
it.
that there's still time that we can make those exceptions if we can. I don't advocate that all the time, but there are sometimes it makes sense to
Makes sense.
deviate a little bit.
So I see a suspicious lack of what exactly is the fire code requirements. So we had it spelled out last time, and that's kind of what the debate was.
Should it just say current fire code? Because
It would be the most, current edition of the IFC. Now, there might be some things that that aren't necessarily related, because IFC is very large, right? Those items specifically, what we're looking at, 26 feet is for, requirements, but for parking on one side. Now, there are variable widths that are less than that, but as it pertains to the 26 feet, that was really essentially the one item, at least as it pertains specifically to this.
So I remember one of the things we asked was to get the recommendation of Unified Fire. Did you get the recommendation of Unified Fire on what Unified Fire would like, not what they think the developers want, but what Unified Fire wants out of that? What was their recommendation?
So Unified Fire, they essentially, they reached out to Harriman City a while back, and we discussed that, but they didn't have a formal recommendation as, hey, this is what I think your standard should say. So that, I don't know if that answers your question, Mayor, but there's no formal recommendation, hey, Harriman City standard should say this. Does that make sense? Did I answer it?
It does.
Okay. So then, and then the other one on here that should be noted is, we would say all residential units shall be accessible and addressed off a roadway that conforms to either a public or private roadway requirement as described above, which is essentially saying you can't be addressed off of an alley, right?
What's the minimum width that allows for parking on both sides of the street?
For both sides, for drivable width, so drivable width, which is from face of curb to face of curb, that's 32 feet.
Okay. So in my opinion, and this isn't going to change, so just so you know where I stand, in my opinion, that 26 feet needs to be 32 feet. That allows parking on both sides, because unless there are not structures on both sides. But if there are structures on both sides of the street, then there needs to be parking on both sides of the street. If there's only structures on one side of the street, I would be comfortable with allowing for the 26 feet for parking on one side. But with the number of private roads that we have, they almost all have townhomes, both sides, and we always have a parking issue, and then it turns into an access issue for our first responders. I've seen it before, and I want to make sure it doesn't happen again.
And Mayor, that's some good feedback. And if I could just interject a quick thought in general, kind of overarching this conversation is, although we have this proposal and we've collaborated with multi-departments and discussing this, I should state this, that staff and the department is ready to support the council's decision.
Of course.
In whatever direction we go.
We
Right?
appreciate
I
it.
just wanted to make sure that was understood.
That is always known.
So,
Where did the 26 feet number come from? Why is that the number?
So that's a good question. So 26 feet specifically allows for, if you
Park on one side of the road.
park on one side of the road, in addition to it allows a utility. Anytime you get less than 26 feet, you can't, the UFA and IFC does not allow for a fire hydrant. So to ensure that utilities can be placed there, 26 feet needs to be that minimum. If that makes sense.
And Mayor, just to, you know, you asked a question a minute ago, just kind of about IFC and the standard there. If you go in the current code, if you go to Appendix D, that is fire department access. And what you're going to see in there is it talks about 20 feet clear drivable surface, which then leads into the next piece of 26 feet drive that allows for parking on one side because of the parking issues we've been. And then it talks, and then obviously the next step is the utilities and the access, specifically obviously to fire hydrants and the square width around the fire hydrants. But again, it's a process in there. And if you start at the beginning of it, it's going to talk about 20 feet of a compact all-weather driving surface. But again, those are for, again, some of those exceptions, mainly when you're talking about a flag lot or something of that nature, where it's not a public street, and how much width do you need?
And that's why I wanted to specify that if there's not structures on both sides, I'm far more comfortable with the 26 feet because we're not going to run into that issue. My concern is these larger, HOAs that do have townhomes on both sides. And if we say the road only has to be this big, once it's private property, we don't have the ability to force them to not allow parking on one side of the road, which means there will be parking on both sides of the road. We see it in all of the townhome communities we have. We know that that's an issue and that's a problem. And so my concern is we have an opportunity now to prevent that from even being an issue, and making sure they have fire access. So I'm totally fine with, if it's only on one side, great, 26 is fine, I don't have any problem with that. But if it is on both sides of the road, where we're parking on both sides of that road, I'm pretty, like, for me, I'm pretty firm that I'd like to see that 32 feet.
I think you bring up a good point because, we stood out on the corner of a street that was narrow, and that's a problem. It may look good on paper, but in practicality, that doesn't, it doesn't work.
Yeah, it was 50 feet wide.
And that was 50 feet wide? No, but it had parking on both sides.
back walk.
50 feet back walk. We
Drivable
have-
space, how much was
We
there?
have, it's 20, probably 28, I think, 20.
When we looked at this, it was
Right, but we had parking on
Right,
both
so-
sides and nobody could get through in the middle. It was impossible, right?
That street width was the reason we went to 53. Fire marshal came in and they looked and they widened from 50 to 53 to allow for parking to happen, so.
But again, just in speaking in support of the mayor's point there is, that is an insufficient width if there are, homes on both sides of the street. To allow for only parking on one side of the street, especially in some of these higher density communities, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
And being private property, we will not have the ability to mitigate it at all because it'll be private property. We can't do anything about it, which means we may be possibly putting public safety at risk by not allowing somebody to get through because somebody's parked in the wrong. And I know that our first responders, they love pushing cars out of the way with the fire truck, but that's not the. That's exactly my point, is we would much rather just have free access so that they can get there in time and avoid any potential public safety risks there. So that, for me, and I've had lots of conversations about this, and I know how people know how I feel about about private roads. But in this specific circumstance, the issue for me really is public safety access. And so if there's housing on both sides or structures on both sides, that's what I would like to see. Now, if there's not, like I said, if it's only on one side, well, then of course it would make sense that we allow them to park on one side of the street and not because there's nobody on the other side of the street. If there's a wall or something, whatever, that's fine. But if it's got structures on both sides, I'd really like to see the 32 feet drivable surface.
So I have a friend that lives in Daybreak, and I never think that we should make Karam Daybreak, I'm not alluding to that, but when you talk about being addressed, like, she lives on the street, and sometimes I go to find her house, and at first it was like, oh, dang, where are you? But it's because they have their main street, and then they have like maybe 3 or 4 houses in a row, and like there's grass in between, and it's 3 or 4 houses face each other. But then on the backs of them, you pull down the little lane, and you pull into their 2-car garages all the way down. but they're really more like little private
Yeah.
alley.
They're an alley loaded
So we're
product.
saying we would not allow that kind of development, right?
Well, we would allow the development perhaps. I guess I'm not speaking to that, but the standard would state that they would have to be addressed off of a roadway that conforms to what's defined as a roadway. So they would not be able to be addressed off of an alley per se.
Okay, got it. So that you, so
They
it
can
still
still have
allows
the
that,
alleys,
because
but
their
the-
address is off the street, but it's hard to find. They're asking, it's like, well, here's the street, but I don't understand. And so it takes.
Yes, and also the key.
But you can still do that.
You still can, and the key term there is it's got to be accessible, right? So, and anyway, so that's,
Okay.
So I see that
Can't
they're-
address off the alley, but because they are addressing off the street, the main
that's-
street to access their alley, that's how it's.
correct. So,
I was
one
curious.
one point if I can add, and I think this has been some pretty good feedback. I want to talk about a little bit of a why, if that's okay. If it's a point that's kind of developing in my mind, I just want to make sure that we also state, as you know, that the state's mandated that Harbin City allows for and is essentially requiring compliance and encouraging low-impact development features. And a standard curb and gutter and sidewalk, well, I'll just maybe say even curb and gutter, may not necessarily lend itself to low-impact development, where you might offer for bioswales or anything that allows for infiltration right off of a roadway, something unconventionally that we've normally seen. And allowing a developer for a private development to take that level of flexibility, to look outside of the typical conventional box, that's a little bit of the why on this here. Now, I still think that can be achieved with the feedback I've heard, at least even with, the 32 feet and whatnot, and what I've been hearing. I think, what we might hear, we can be accomplishing what we're shooting for as well. So anyway, any questions or thoughts there?
On the pedestrian path, then, does that, when it says along the road, does that mean it has to be connected to the road, or can it have a park strip?
That's a good question. It does not designate right here whether it has a park strip or not. I have heard recent feedback from our city planner that would make a lot of sense to include that particular item.
Okay.
To require a park strip.
Well, and what I don't want is I don't want it to be, to insinuate through this that it does not allow for a park strip. I would want to make sure that option is allowed. And the way I read this, when it says along the road, almost sounds connected to the road and not necessarily, like, it's just not, maybe too vague. And if we can, or too specific, I don't know. I'd like that to be maybe reworded just a little bit, just so that, because I am totally in support of those other features for infiltration and swells and all that, like that doesn't really necessarily cause me any major concern. I'm fine with that kind of stuff, and I want to make sure we do allow for that. So I just don't want to,
One of the concerns I do have, though, if we do allow for sidewalk right at the back of curb, is then it becomes parking area.
yes,
They drive up.
Yeah,
they just park on the
sidewalk,
sidewalk.
park on the side.
It's just more pavement if there's no curb.
And
Well, even if
speaking
there's-
with surrounding cities, they have talked about typical, and this is just kind of ideas, just kind of thrown out there and just spitballing some things. One particular city, they say they don't have a crown, and so this is a smaller local roadway, and they'll bend it one direction. I'm not saying that this is the direction we need to go, but just kind of ideas that are out there, but they turn it one direction, and that side on the uphill side is they call it a monolithic pour, where you have curb and gutter and sidewalk right up against, but down on the downhill side, where you have water collecting, you would have that park strip. But that doesn't eliminate that issue to your point.
Well,
So, it's a good point.
I don't want to conflate engineering standard with a design standard, right? But I mean, I understand the idea of being able to preserve space so that there is a reasonable park strip if that's proper design. But I also think, and not to be at odds with our city planner, but respectfully, I think that there are a lot of reasons why parking strips may not be the best idea. We've talked about water standards, right? The importance of maintaining and beautifying these, and how much water and effort and energy it takes. You put them in, they look great, and then after a few years, they kind of deteriorate and they're not as pretty as they used to be. So I think there's, and again, this might be more of a design thing than it is an engineering standard, but I think that there's compelling arguments to be made that a sidewalk right against the curb is just good design and makes sense.
Well, and to your point, it all comes down to really what the overall road width is.
Right, exactly.
And what it allows on there, what people are comfortable doing.
Right.
If they know it's a narrow roadway, they're gonna park up on the sidewalk that's right there because they're concerned about the access to parking.
Right.
Can I
Yeah.
add a clarification? Go
No,
ahead.
no, I was just gonna say, like, right, just north of me, because 7300, they required them to do precast wall out there. So you have a precast wall, so those three houses are gonna come across the precast wall and take care of the park strip right there.
Right.
And so it's just this dirt hole all along there.
Yeah,
It's like
right.
nothing's there, you know? Because they're like,
What do we call those
whose
morphing
job is
strips?
to take
Yeah.
care of it? Because they're like, well, it's not ours. It was given to the city, so the city should take care of it. And how many park strips can we possibly take care of, you know? Oh, and
Yeah, so there's an O&M, there's a water, right?
Yeah.
And
But as
All
far as
perfect.
beautification, to have trees along the park strips, then it's like, that's beautifying your city. So I understand that side of the
Right.
argument too.
yeah,
But
exactly. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be concerned about beautifying our city. There may be
But we
There
don't
may
want
be different ideas on how to do that, but again, that's more of a design standard discussion. It is an engineering discussion, but I understand making a consideration for those design elements in our standards, right? Being understand that could be a possibility and make accommodations for that.
Okay. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention one thing, that a clarifying point might be that a park strip may not necessarily mean, and I think, so I guess that's, before I jump into that point, I guess I would just want a little bit of direction on what the thoughts are in the end towards that park strip direction, right? But the thought and clarifying point is park strip doesn't necessarily mean turf, right?
Yeah.
It could mean really anything. It could be a bioswale. It could be one of those low impact development components. The developer will be, it will be required to meet those low impact development requirements. And it might behoove the developer to put those park strips in to some extent at some point. Anyway.
I need to raise my hand, teacher. What was a bioswell?
It's a big mound.
You need something to draw on.
I need a driveway for it. Essentially a collection place for runoff to sit and to infiltrate into the ground.
We can share images
ditch.
with you, Steve, and show you
Okay.
what that looks like.
Yeah, I got it.
It's a ditch.
Yeah, I lived in Houston for a couple years. I know what it is. Right? Soft shoulders running off into, I got it.
Kind of like that. One thing I wanted to bring up is park strips are really helpful for things that we need, street furniture we need to put in, like lights, signs, things like that. So
snow removal.
maybe 5-foot wide park strips can shrink down to 2 feet, but we really need to have some room to put those things.
So
Yeah,
is it the recommendation of staff then that we change the language to include that a park strip is required? Is that what we're trying to, I'm trying to get I want to know what staff wants out of this because I'm not necessarily, I'm not at a point where we have to say we have to have park strips. I'm not at a point to say we have to say we don't have to have park strip. I think this may not even be the right place for it. But if there's a recommendation from a standards point that we need a park strip, then maybe that's something that we want to get in here. But I don't know what I'm not the expert here. I don't know.
At your point, maybe there's again, we're talking about kind of minimum standards, right? Maybe there is a minimum park strip we need to have. Right? I don't know.
If you're talking a public roadway, I think Blake spoke to a couple of those points. And Councilmember Orn also brought up another, which is snow plowing, street lights.
Yeah.
So there's benefits of a park strip, even outside of the low impact development requirements. But you are correct. I'm essentially hitting a minimum, but we're not necessarily against if council decides, hey, we want to require a park strip as a minimum standard. I think this wouldn't be an inappropriate place to put it.
Michael, what's your thoughts?
Yes, thank you. I would like to raise a question for consideration, and I think the question needs to be answered by Chase, or you need to consider this for a future discussion. Let me preface that by saying I'm not opposed to private streets. I'm not opposed to creative solutions. Right now, in our ordinance, we basically give the developer the flexibility to choose public or private. But because they have to build a public road to city standards, there's no incentive really for them to do a private road. If we create an option that they get to choose, it's their discretion to choose to do a private road, and the cost of building that private road is cheaper, we're more likely to see, that's an incentive. we're more likely to see developers choose that option. What I'm asking is, can the city have the discretion whether or not it's our choice to allow the private option? Because right now we're saying it's the developer's choice. I'm suggesting that if we give them the option, they're always going to
That's a smart
choose
question.
the cheapest option.
Because
And if it's our
didn't change, didn't we
choice,
just make all the developers just pay for everything? That seems like a.
but I'm just saying, if you're saying it's an option to do the cheaper solution, you're going to see a lot more of that. And is that really what we want? If that's our standards, fine, that's our standards. But just be prepared. You're going to see a lot more of it. And you
Well, I
may
appreciate you
not
bringing-
like
Yeah,
what we see.
I appreciate you bringing it up because it was actually a question or a thought that I had, that if we're making them build it to city standards, we're just going to end up owning and maintaining everything.
It's expensive for the city.
Yes, absolutely. There is an advantage to private streets and not having to take on the O&M that goes along with it. So how do we properly, I guess, I don't know if I want to use the word, there has to be an incentive for them to do it, right?
That's a really interesting philosophical question, right, about proper design is, sure, we would love have private roads we don't have to pay for and maintain, right? That's a great idea. But then, are we getting roads that are
Substandard.
substandard? I don't want to indicate that they're poorly built or, poorly designed or something, but that they just,
Present access issues.
they could present, well, not only safety and access issues, city beautification issues, right? A cohesive city, property values, like all of those things are part of what planning goes into, right? Trying to preserve this for a long time, not just what's convenient for one particular subdivision. So maybe that's a little broader discussion to have.
And this is, I alluded to my thoughts on that earlier. When it comes to private roads, I frankly think we shouldn't have them. I think all cities' roads should meet city standard, or all roads in the city should meet city standards, even if they're private, because we have run in, we've seen it time and time again, what happens when we allow the private roads and then we end up in the situations where exactly what Michael referred to, they want to make more money, so they're pushing houses closer together, or they want to do the cheaper option, so they're making smaller roads, and we run into all those options. So my personal belief is that we should require them to do public standards on all private roads. Now, with that being said, I also think that there's got to be a middle ground as well. I think that in regards to park strips, I think we could probably word something similar to what I think we should do for the 26 feet, where if you have residential structures on each side of the road, you need to provide park strips on each side of the road. If you only have residential structures on one side of the road, I'm a lot more willing to say, okay, the other side of the road doesn't need to necessarily have a sidewalk and street lights and everything else. But what that would do is that would, I think, help mitigate some of the issues for flag lots or these unique one-offs that we really would expect to actually see this stuff on, and would diminish the desire of developers in these larger high-density communities from putting in sidewalks on one side of the street, because they don't have to, because it's not there. But if they have residential buildings on both sides of this access, guess what? You're going to put in a park strip, and you're going to put in a sidewalk. So that's me trying to think through this and saying, how can we reasonably find an answer? Sure, please do.
For 1 second. So then, how do you approach the multifamily development where we have a lot of them in the city, where they're a 3-story unit, garages all across the bottom? There is the road, there is no sidewalk because it's all driveway. There is no parking on either side of the street because it's all driveway. How do you, again, playing devil's advocate, how do you approach that scenario?
No, and that's fair. I would disagree on the being that no sidewalk, because if they have driveways, there should be room for a sidewalk, because that's just in front at the end of the driveway, because every driveway I know has a sidewalk that runs across it. So,
Are you going to allow them to count, does that have to be sidewalk, or does that count for the overall length of the driveway?
well, we already have that. That's fair, and we do already have that in our code. On the parking on either side of the street, I think that's something that we can't necessarily address, and that's what they do choose to do if they're going to do, you know, a 3-story, something along the lines of that. And I don't think we can engineer it down to that level. There's just no way for us to do it. And so,
But do you allow them to go to basically, per fire code, a 20-foot driving surface because you can't have the parking on both sides. It meets code, and now it's not gonna meet this, and it's going to be a private street, and they're gonna do all the maintenance in there. See, do you see my point?
yeah, I see your, no, I mean, that's a fair point. I think that's addressed, I mean, it's a fair point, but I would say that's probably more addressed in the parking requirements for a multifamily structure, where there's a certain number of parking units that have to be available for multiple story structures. I would say those things are probably taken care of in the other places. I absolutely probably right. We can't address every issue and get everywhere, but from a minimum standard, I would say this is, I mean, like I said, I want to go everything to public, you know, to what we would require as a city standard for everything. But for me, trying to be, you know, I don't want to come off as my way is the only right way, because it's not. I know there's other ways to do it, and I think that trying to base off of where the residential structures are is at least a good start. And we might even say for single-family homes as opposed to multifamily, you know, and just call that out differently. But that would be. I'm trying to make sure that I'm looking as a partner with the developers and saying, hey, look, we get it, but we also need, so here's the give and take, and how do we make sure that our city is protected, public safety is preserved, and avoid the other issues. If we're in a public safety issue on a multifamily development, then we're gonna have to deal with something else.
So again, my comment is I would like to see us have the discretion. The standard, the by right development pattern is city standard. The option of jumping into a private alternate standard or alternate design is at the city's discretion to approve that. We can say no. So right now, there's certain things you can't say no to, right? You have to allow development if it meets certain
But those two
standards.
things are at odds with each other, right? I mean,
But-
there's this idea of our standards aren't just about what's pretty. Our standards are about safety and accommodation to the neighborhoods and everything else, right? I mean, it is, we have standards for a reason. That's why there's local control for all of these things. But then you also have this, if you're allowing a developer a choice to build their own roads, they don't want to build to the same standards, right? They want to make it less expensive. That's the whole reason to do it.
I'm just saying, it's kind of like a planned development, right? You're choosing to go into a negotiated agreement.
Right.
It's the same thing with a private road. You're choosing the option of doing that. It's the city's choice to approve it or not. If you're building a subdivision and you're building a city standard road, how do we say no to that, right? It's a standard.
Yeah, that's
But
true.
this is a negotiated option. And if it's negotiated, I want to make sure that we have the right to say no.
And I don't know the answer off the top of my head. I think it's not as simple as yes and no either. I think there are a lot of policy considerations to take into account, as well as the legal aspects of it. I know. This is the first time of the year I've been here.
Well, I mean,
right?
look, for
No, but
only
it's-
3 points and a couple of, letters, I think this has been a really interesting conversation. I think we should go through every page like this. But I would really love to see a comeback with a kind of a little more detail about, I mean, we've raised a lot of questions. Maybe answering some of those questions and some staff recommendations about how we could at least address some of those questions.
Mayor said something a second ago that I kind of want to bring up. I think it was you, might have been Clint. You're saying a separate standard possibly for multifamily and single family. Another thing to think about, we just ran into this the other day, is commercial. We had a commercial development come in and they said, we don't want to build a full road down through these buildings, because all they're trying to do is get the building to front a road to be able to build it, because that's part of our code. And so they wanted parking out in front of the building. It's an office building.
Yeah, I mean, they're gonna have parking.
And so maybe there's a separate standard as well that we need to consider.
I would love to
for-
hear a recommendation from
That's a
staff.
really good point.
Jonathan, quick question for you as we talk about some of these things. So if you let's take the product that's just to the west of us here. So basically those plot homes that are built with a single, basically alley, I guess. How our standards have changed now, so, because now we're requiring driveways and, because they don't have any driveways over there, right? It's just the alleyway that's to the front of their garage. I'm guessing that they're all addressed off of the actual loop street that goes around to it, which is a narrow private street. But all of these things basically would not allow that type of a development and product today, correct?
I'm trying to think, I don't know if, are you saying, let me just repeat, make sure I understand.
Well, we've, obviously the road width in there is not narrow, but I'm only talking about how it's addressed off of that. I don't know for sure how they're addressed off there. Because you got basically four or six homes that are on basically one drive, with all of their garages that go to it. And then the loop road is up here. Are they all addressed off of that road? And how does that now fall in line with what we're proposing right here?
I'd have to double check to see certainly on that, but I think that, I don't know that that would necessarily preclude and disallow what they're doing.
Okay.
As long as they're being addressed again off of a roadway that meets those minimum standards. So they, so
So
they
if
might
that
even
loop road
have,
was slightly larger, they would meet the requirements and they'd be fine.
that's probably a good way of stating it, and then they could have, an alley along the back that they could utilize for access.
Okay.
I have, unrelated to streets, in regards to the walking path,
Yes,
it just says paved.
sure.
What does paved exactly mean?
We
Does it
could get
mean
it dialed,
asphalt when we have concrete?
concrete or a hard surface,
So
either
that means we
concrete or
have a
asphalt.
concrete road and an asphalt sidewalk.
Yeah,
So can we straighten that out to say equal or better than, are similar to the surface of the road? How do we do, because what I don't want to see is just a cheap asphalt path when there really should be a concrete sidewalk.
But I would say primarily you're gonna see an asphalt road, and that would allow them to do an asphalt.
That's true.
And we're really only doing asphalt paths in places where there's trail connectivity, or where we anticipate trail connectivity.
I'm saying on a
So-
private road, how do we get a concrete, what I'm saying is how do we get concrete sidewalks as opposed to asphalt paths? But at the same time,
right now, probably cheaper to do
Oh.
asphalt.
but I'm not sure I know the right answer, and it's a question. It's a question, not I demand that in any way. That is really just a question, more of
It's
a.
going well for you.
Can I give an example of where, well, I guess that's more of a question, is that a requirement the council would like to
That's a
ensure?
great question.
Ensure that it's
I'm
concrete?
pretty sure none of the council wants to see asphalt sidewalks along,
So let me give a,
residential roads.
and residential, I guess, is one point.
Because of trail connectivity and active transportation. So on Juniper Crest is the perfect place for it, right?
Hidden Oaks is doing something.
Hidden Oaks is doing some.
So's
So there's
the,
some places, 6400 will have an asphalt trail
Yep.
down,
What I want to avoid is just doing it because it's cheaper. That's what I'm trying to avoid.
just for.
that's it's a good question, Mayor, and I don't know if the standard will be able to sift that out.
And we may not be able to, and I'm okay with that.
Residential.
So let's say, for example, we were just talking, and this is the same project that Blake just brought up, is along this commercial roadway. On the one side, they have the parking, where you'll have the sidewalk that kind of follows the parking. And on the other side, it is actually a connection through the trail. So the trail on the others, that's right.
Which would make sense.
Is asphalt on the other. And I don't know if in a standard, if I have enough space to ride out every case. And so that's why I kind of left it, and it might even be hard surface. So I guess that's a question I'd throw back for discussion and.
Well, I'm just thinking in a residential neighborhood, we have houses on both sides.
Yeah, yeah.
And you have street, curb and gutter. I don't think you want asphalt sidewalks.
Can we attach it to the curb and gutter? That we've got concrete curb and gutter, it should be concrete unless authorized by the active transportation plan?
Good luck with that.
It's your.
My recommendation on that would be something where you always require concrete unless the planning commission in their process approves another surface.
Is
Then
that,
they'll be able to see a trail connection. or
We should have
something.
fun plan. Love that.
They got it.
Yes, what I just heard is defer to planning commission.
Well, 'cause they'll be able to see the overall plan.
And
Yeah,
so
I
would
like-
make that
I think that's it.
recommendation.
No, I actually think, I really like that.
That is a good suggestion. yeah.
I'm not trying to make things more difficult, I'm just trying to make sure that this is the
They're good
place we gotta,
questions.
this is the place we gotta figure it out, because if we don't figure it out now, then we just get the cheapest and crafty sauce.
Well, Mayor, it's been a healthy conversation. I really do. I really think that. I think, so what I've heard is we come back. We've recorded this, obviously. We'll go through and we'll study it out. Come back and bring something to you. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes. Did we give you enough muddy direction?
We'll go through the recording.
All right. Anything else that you need us to discuss?
Not at this point.
Okay.
That's
No,
enough.
no.
Like,
We're gonna go back to the phone booth now.
So what I'm going to say was please no.
Just going over his standards and its uniform.
Is he in the corner crying?
I see the S disappearing.
The fact that I think we're down to just this like one issue is, I think, a testament to the hard work that you and the rest of the staff has put into this. I know you guys have been working on this for years, and the fact that this is the issue that we're down to and we're very quickly approaching an end so we can have a truly updated standard is fantastic, and I appreciate that. So even though you're gonna go cry in the corner, like,
Thank you. I won't be crying.
we appreciate it. All right, with
It has robust EAP service.
with that, we'll move on to item 2.2, Harriman City Fire Service funding discussion. Chase.
Thank you.
and Alan.
So I hope this conversation isn't as robust. I think it should be a little more straightforward. The reason we're bringing it back tonight is the county gave us a call just asking what our plan was with the fire service district that we initially took the steps to create at the end of last year.
And then we put it in the HCC.
Right, and so that's part of the discussion is, previously we had a conversation about funding all of public safety out of HCC. As Alan and I dug into the numbers, we realized that the mill levy necessary to fund both fire and police out of HCC would actually exceed the maximum rate allowable by law. And so it wouldn't be sustainable under there. You can actually charge a levy more than what's allowed by law to cover debt service obligations and certain things that we could potentially finagle that levy to collect for a certain amount of time, but it's, like I said, just not a sustainable rate. So looking at that, we can do a couple of things. We can still do that for a period of 1 year, create the fire district, and then levy a property tax into the fire district to pay for fire services. The procedure there would be increase HCC's rate, impose a rate for the fire service district, which again would not be collected until 2020. So you're collecting a year's worth of property tax under HCC to make up for that lack of revenue from the fire service district until 2022. You would then go in and reduce HCC's rate back to whatever their sustainable and necessary rate is when the fire service district was able to collect those property taxes as their own independent district. That's an option. Another option would be to, again, leave HCC's rate where it's at and not have to finagle that rate to go above the statutory maximum and just do it under the city's property tax for a year and then reduce that property tax for the city's rate when the fire service district collects
It's about 1 year, great next.
their property tax in 2022. Or the third option is just to fund it out of the city's property tax and not pull the final trigger on establishing the fire service district. So procedurally, it's the same. The net impact to the residents is the same regardless of where it's collected. It's more of just what process do we want to go through? Where do we want to have that collected for the year until either it remains with the general fund or is funded through the fire service district? Did I explain that sufficiently?
So Jason, I've got a question for you. If, I guess depending on, we'd have to go through a truth and taxation.
We would.
No matter which route we decided to go initially.
Correct.
Whether we're raising the city's property taxes or we're raising HCC's.
Correct.
Go through truth and taxation. So then beyond that, when we would lower one or the other, and if we pull the trigger and go through, we can just set that rate at whatever we're reducing, or do we, if we pull the trigger and go through and create the district, do we have to go through a truth and taxation then to establish the rate for that, or is it?
You would, yes.
There's gonna be two.
You wouldn't have to do a truth in taxation to reduce your rate
Right.
again, because you can charge anything below the certified rate without having another truth in taxation hearing. But you would have to have a truth and taxation hearing, and go through that whole process if you were to collect it, again, through the fire service district.
But if we chose to just leave it under the city's property taxes indefinitely, we'd go through the truth and taxation once.
Just once, right.
And then not going forward,
And then it's just funded out of general.
out of general fund.
So police would still remain the same. They would still stay under HCC, and their funds would stay within that district. And then the fire services would be paid for out of.
Alan, what's your recommendation on the?
Well, just so you know, no matter which way we go, there will be a separate fund for the fire funds. So it's okay with me either way, but it will be a separate fund, just like we're keeping the HCC separate. The fund already exists.
So you do it in a sub-fund of the general fund, and it's,
Just do that as a part.
Well, I know there's a lot of people that don't look at their property tax notice, but there's a lot of people that do.
Right.
And I just 100% would rather it be very distinctly different.
agree.
I think it needs to be the police, I think it needs to be fire, and I think it needs to be the city for all of the stated reasons. I'm not comfortable with it being underneath the Harriman City.
And that's okay, but it can't be that way this year.
Right.
Yeah.
So the pathway quickest to that is what I would choose to do.
And my recommendation, and Alan can give his as well, would just be to do it general fund, or under the city's property tax for the 1 year.
For the 1 year.
And then lower the city's property tax back down.
So
And
does that require truth and taxation for the cities?
it would,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I would disagree with that because once again, I think that goes to the transparency of we want to do it as to make it clear that it is the fire service. And so it would be my personal preference right now that we do it as the fire service district. And then
As
just do-
HCC?
Or as HCC, so yeah, HCC, so that it's clear it's the safety service area, and then move it into a separate on the next year. That's my preference. Now, I'm not so hardcore about that I'm gonna be like mad about it if we choose to keep it in the general fund. But I think it's easier for our residents to understand the reason that the tax is increasing is not because we're just getting more property taxes. It's because this is going for fire service.
Right.
But we can raise that above the allowed rate for 1 year.
And I'll tell you my concern, and we haven't been able to get an answer from the county on this, is the maximum rate for a local district is 0.0023. In order to adequately fund both fire and service, we would have to go closer to 2.9, I think, or 3, Alan, in that ballpark. Again, you can do that if what you're using that additional tax revenue for is to pay for debt obligations. We are paying for debt obligations, but they're not ours, if that makes sense. When we withdrew from UFSA, we agreed by contract to pay our portion of that debt obligation, but it's not the debt obligation of HCC or the fire service district or even Harriman City. And so that's my concern, is that the county may at the end of the day say, we're not going to certify a rate that high.
So when will we know? When are they supposed to give us an answer back?
If I had my crystal ball, right? I don't think it'll be too hard to get that answer from them. Yeah, I mean, what I mean by that is, I don't think it's a difficult answer. It's just getting it back from them.
To your point, Mayor, honestly, I kind of keep going back and forth a little bit on which one, because what I want to be is as transparent as we can be of what it is we're doing, why we're doing it, and what it will be moving forward. And I think that I have concerns on both sides, obviously, in being able to adequately educate and keep the transparency. To Sherry's point, keeping it under, there's gonna be some of the residents who are like, oh, well, that was just a ploy to increase our property taxes.
That's exactly
And
what I think is.
and on the other side, I think there's a little bit of that difficult transparency too, when it's under HCC, which they now associate to the police department. And they're like, well, are they just gonna increase this and keep it here and then fund this over here? So I think it's a valid concern on both sides, and I don't know that I have a firm preference one way or the other than I do recognize that there's a concern of how high we would have to go and if the county would actually approve that.
I will say too, that, and you've all identified this issue, it's gonna take a communication really just overhaul to get this message across.
Yeah, there's no way around.
It's no, and really the
Yeah.
key point is no one's taxes are actually going up. The line item will have a huge increase percentage-wise, but the reduction from our withdrawal of UFSA actually offsets that. So again, it's a net neutral change to the actual tax bill. But it, like Jared identified, it's going to be a huge process that you can't get around whatever way you ultimately
There's
choose.
that contingent that wants to see it as an increase, will see it that way,
Right.
whether it is or not, no matter how much communication we give. One question I have is the timing process. So if we choose to do HCC and the county says no, do we have enough time to then change?
So we have, we have until June 22nd to notify the county of a truth and taxation process. So we don't have to hold those hearings in June, but we have to let them know by June 22nd that we plan on going through truth and taxation. And then we have some public hearing requirements and some notice
When,
requirements.
you said they may not, so if we do HCC, they may not approve the higher rate for the 1 year.
Right.
If they deny it, then we have time to change course.
They
Or is
may
that done
not
before
even
we?
tell us that till we try to certify
And
it,
that's my,
which would
that's
be
my-
too late.
That's my question.
they may certify a rate of, 0.0024 or 25, or even
And we'd
just the
be
maximum,
underfunded.
and then we'd be underfunded and
And
it would
then
be.
like the tax increase the next time we go through it.
Right, because we would have to make up that difference somewhere, so.
That's hard, because I think the messaging from me, this is only just obviously how I would think of it, but as a taxpayer, I'd be like, okay, I'm okay with that because it's going to emergency services. But then if I see, oh, Kansas City increasing their taxes, regardless of how you message it, I think sometimes mentally people
And
go there.
it's, I mean, the HCC, I think that's one easier to explain, but also it's better optics to be able to point to the fact that it is temporary. We cannot keep it
Right.
that way. It's just for 1 year and it's just replacing the one that's already there. Then we go through that whole thing, but it's still safety. Has to be temporary for this reason.
So
You're talking, if we go the
You go
HCC route.
HCC, right? But if you just go with the city, then it looks like a real tax increase.
You don't ever have to increase it.
And when we get around to this time next year, there's different people in these seats who may want to keep it that way.
We could have a complete, we could have, 3 seats are up this year, we could have 3 separate individuals sitting in there, and even though I think we're all fairly agreed what we want to have happen, those 3 people could have a completely different idea of what they want. And so for me, I would much rather, so my preference, I think the direction we might be heading, and I'm not telling you yet, but my suggestion would be, let's see if we can get the county to give us a nod on putting in the HCC first before we need to send in the request for certification. If we can't get any sort of a nod from them ahead of time, then we might need to do it through the city. But I think my preference would be to do the HCC so that it's clear and so that when we're moving it out, it is something that was just safety to another safety fund. And it's not just general fund balance.
I would make a comment here. I think regardless of the optics on the property taxes, we cannot let it be underfunded. That is not an opportunity
I
that
agree.
we
For
can,
sure.
I don't care what it looks like on the property taxes,
Yes.
right? That's not exactly true, but. That is of less significance than having it underfunded.
Yes.
So if we cannot get a clear direction or a nod or a thumbs up, then we must go forward with it in the general and just deal with the outcome of that. We'll have to, really hard on communication and understanding, but we have to move forward that way.
And now,
Comes back to the same question, what's typical in this process? Do we have anything to go by? Is it possible to get a reliable nod? Right, because we can get a nod and then have them at the last minute go, oh.
well, and again, that's.
Yes,
I'm not
You can
saying,
get a nod, but it also comes with a wink.
because there's a lot that can happen between now and then, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no problem, and then, a staffer picks up something and says, hey, this maybe isn't a good thing. And we have to consider all the possibilities.
Well, the county auditor has taken a hard line against everything we've talked to him about so far.
It's been interesting.
And so I expect they will on this too. I guess the thing I would add to this though too, is whether this goes into our general fund initially or HCC initially, our budget actually spells out how this will be moved into the fire fund separating it from these others immediately, okay? And so we can talk about it being, he mentioned it's going in the general fund. It's also being moved immediately into the fire fund.
I agree.
Or into the HCC, it's going immediately into the fire.
The problem is not this year.
Yeah.
The problem is next year, when we might have a different council. And
It's
that's more than anything else, like, because I agree with Steve that it is better that it is funded correctly than that the optics are what we would like the,
You know, Mayor, regardless, a new council can change everything you just said with one vote.
I understand that.
Everything.
They want a tax increase, they can get a tax
I'm
increase.
obviously very aware of that,
Yeah.
but I would like to do everything in my power to set it up to reasonably assure our residents as much as we can that this is the intent of the body as we sit now and go from there. I can't change what they
Pick
do.
whichever way you
It
want.
sounds like you have enough time to vet this out a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if we can vet it out, yes. If the auditor comes back and says, absolutely not, we'll do it through the general fund.
It took us, what, 10 weeks, that's 3 months, to get them to tell us whether or not they would accept January 4th as a date instead of January 1st. Okay? That's what we're dealing with and getting answers.
Well, all
So
that
we're on
means,
the clock with June 20, if we don't get 100% by June 21st, we got to file. and-
we went through obviously a very similar education campaign with our public when we created HCC and all of that. I have obviously total confidence in our communications team that whichever route it is, they can communicate that effectively for
And-
us. I think we agree that if it's possible through HCC, it seems a little clearer in terms of public safety and those types of things. But regardless of what it is, we'll obviously find out those answers, but I have total confidence in our communications
And
team.
let's be clear, it doesn't matter whether it doesn't matter whether it's in HCC, it doesn't matter whether it's in fire, it doesn't matter whether it's in general fund. There are those that will be looking at their property tax notices, and if there's a change, we're gonna hear about it. We just have to be prepared to answer it and guide them to get education, because all our attempts to be transparent and keep those, there's still people who are gonna be pissed and didn't listen to this meeting, right?
Absolutely.
One last question I have for Alan. This is just a question for the county auditor. It's at his sole discretion.
No, I think it would actually end up being the lieutenant governor eventually, but we're trying to deal through the state auditor, or the county auditor, who is the one
Whose office certifies the tax.
they certify our tax.
So I have my direction. I think it's understood that we'll find out with the county, what their viewpoint is on this. And then if we can't get a nod from them or some assurances there, we'll move forward with bringing it in under the city's property tax. But the consequence of that as well is we now need to just get that resolution approving the fire district, or creating the fire district approved. So I'll have to bring that. That's the last step in that process. And there's no timetable on that. We've gone through all of the other steps to create the fire service district. I can just bring the resolution, we can review it, and then bring it to either the consent agenda or even the,
We have a meeting on the
May I
12th.
suggest that we set a timetable on that, let's just get it done,
yeah.
rather than, because we know we don't have to,
Right.
let's base up on it.
On the other issues, so let's get that fire stuff.
Yep.
13th, whatever it is.
Well,
Yeah.
All right. That was all sorts of fun. 2.3, annexation area update. Blake.
So I think while this is coming up, the presentation up there, we're just looking for some discussion here on this item. And so I'm just going to give a brief review of our meeting that we had on April 27th with the Olympia Hills Development Team. And so it's really hard to see, but this is just our vicinity map. And so in that meeting, there was a discussion with potential annexation into Harriman. And so some of those discussion items, this is the area we're kind of speaking about, is out in this area that I just highlighted. The potential annexation, as the developer's talking to us, is due to a clause to annex or incorporate into a city after they get to 1,500 units, to an adjoining city. And so The developer has come to us not only for that reason, but saying that if there is development that goes on out there, it's preferable for the staff and the developer. We feel that if it starts in one place, it ends in one place, because then you don't have different standards applied. You don't have a change in the middle of the stream. So it's good practice to have consistent development underneath one standard. There's also discussion of the timeline. I'm just kind of putting some images up here. This is our annexation declaration area that was adopted, a resolution that was approved by the council on December 8th, 2011. And so there was a timeline discussion about if there was an annexation, what needed to happen. Some of the key dates or key timeframes, what would have to happen. October 31st is really the date where you'd be looking for if it was January 1 to come in. Current terms of the Salt Lake County Master Development Agreement were also discussed. There was discussion, this is my last slide. This is the approved land use plan that the county approved with the last time it went through. And so this is the 6,330 unit land use plan. So there was discussion about land uses and zoning. There was discussion about infrastructure and some preliminary discussions about design guidelines for commercial and residential. So the staff is just looking for discussion here, and if there's additional information, reminder that the Bonneville study will be coming to be presented to the council on the 26th of May. And any other thoughts, concerns, just looking for next steps to take on this one.
You know, it was an interesting discussion earlier this week to understand the scope of things that would have to be discussed for an annexation to actually even be considered to happen. I think you just highlighted some of them, right? There's land issues, there's zoning issues, there's infrastructure things, there's design guidelines, there's development agreements. I mean, all of those things are big things. And understanding that there are some, potential dates, deadlines out there to not necessarily have to be done, but if there's a process that was going to be done sooner rather than later, we'd have to get through some of that heavy lifting pretty soon. And I think that one of the recommendations out of that discussion, one of the things that I think would be really appropriate is to really start creating a work group, or a subcommittee is probably the wrong term. I think work group is a work group to really formally start addressing these issues. I don't think that, I think this council has expressed in the past their desire to be a part of these kinds of discussions and negotiations. I don't think it's fair to try and expect staff to negotiate with a full understanding of what the council's maybe ideas or wishes or wants are, nor is I think it's fair for the council members to try and negotiate this with a lack of understanding about all these things, right? So I think the creation of a work group and a more formal discussion that would create, minutes, transparency, involving the public, involving the council, involving all departments of staff, it is a really appropriate step at this point. Look, I don't know that an annexation is the right thing to do. I don't know that the developer has said, yes, they want to go forward. And I don't know that even if the developer said they wanted to go forward, that it would be in Harriman's best interest to do that. I think some of that's still to be determined. But I think we need to determine it. I think that's where I'm at. So you got anything to add? You were in the meeting. What were your thoughts there?
No, I think you summarized a lot of the points really well, Steve. I think, again, in terms of just Herman's viewpoint, I think we agree that whether they're in the city or out of the city, being collaborative in the planning process with them is a positive thing. so that we can try and, again, in the city, obviously, then we make sure that there's that look and feel, that tie, and all of those things that we want for our city now. If they're not in the city, at least we're working collaboratively to make sure that that connection and the other connections with the city flow through and are appropriate. And, you know, there's always, honestly, I think when it comes to annexations, well, let me back up. I think with this potential annexation, there's challenges because we're dealing with a large landmass that already has an approval in place from the county. That's obviously much different than just land that's looking to annex and be able to have that path towards now planning a development. So there's a little bit of I think kind of the chicken and the egg scenario here that we can say, well, we don't really want to invest too much in this until we have a petition for an annexation from them. And on the other side for them, they don't want to give us a petition for annexation or an intent to annex without, I guess, having the opportunity to start looking at some of those things that Steve just brought up, which is, you know, land use and zoning and those types of things, and saying that because right now the zoning that they have, we don't have a zoning that supports that with our city. So I think our planning commission would need to look at that type or a similar type of zone and work through that and give us some recommendations on creating that type of a zone that would line up, that would then create a path for potential annexation. So again, I think that there has to be some effort on both sides in order to answer those questions that Steve just brought up there. And again, there was talk of creating a work group that involved staff, involved some council, and involved some planning commissioners to really start looking at some of these issues these questions that really need to be answered for both sides before we know the answer of, do we move forward with a potential annexation? And again, I think at the end of the day, we know that there's going to be a development there. We want the development because, again, whether it's in our city or outside of our city, to be successful, because it's going to have direct impact on our community. We want to make sure that as it happens, again, if it's outside of the city, we can continue to plan and mitigate and do those things that we need to ensure that we continue to be successful in our own development moving forward. So I think that there is certainly common ground there in that there's interest in both parties being successful because, again, inside or outside, we're going to be forever connected. So the scenario that was kind of used yesterday is, you know what, we've decided to at least start to date a little bit. And now we just need to continue to explore the relationship and see where it goes. And I think that in order to do that, we need to start really formalizing some processes and allowing staff to dig in a little bit deeper to some of those issues, allow some of the issues to actually start being presented and looked at by the planning commission, because there's a lot that involves them going forward. Because without doing that, we're not going to get the answers we need, and I don't think anyone will have the comfort level to make a decision of yes or no, do we proceed? So.
Yeah, to add on to your imperfect analogy there, I do think there's a dating process that you have to go through before you talk about an engagement. An engagement process is a little more serious preparations for a potential wedding, right? Where dating is just seeing whether or not you're interested in getting engaged. So to take that analogy a little further here, I think we need to date a little more seriously. And I don't really know how to say it better than that. It just, the tap dancing around it, thinking, you know, we know you're there, we know you're there, we know we're going to be, you know, sleeping next to each other. Maybe we should find out if this is going to be all right or not. So.
Sure, I'm sorry, did you have a comment?
I do. Obviously, I have lots of comments on this. Dating. The issue with dating here is that we're in the public. And have you ever watched Public Celebrities Day? It's all over everywhere. And the purpose is because everyone wants to know. Well, our job is to make sure all of the public knows. So the problem that we're having is we're having a lot of private meetings, and we have a public that's extremely opposed to the Olympia Hills. They were very vocal, very engaged, and extremely opposed to that. Now, I understand it was approved at the county, but, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of annexation is a process. They don't automatically come in with their zoning. Those are negotiable kind of agreements, okay? So when we stamp this and say, hey, this is what there's approved at the county, doesn't mean that's what it has to come into as a city. It means that's what the county approved. That doesn't mean we have to roll over and pay debt on everything. So those are all negotiable points. And so I guess first off, I never want to go after this saying, well, the county approved it, we have no choice. It's not correct. We have negotiations that we can sit down and negotiate. Now, I'm never opposed to sit down and negotiating. I expressed this many times. I had a meeting with Gordon, Clint, and Doug 2.5 years ago. The meeting went like this. Yeah, bring me a comprehensive plan, help us understand why this works. I can have it to you in a couple weeks. That's the last meeting that I've ever been involved in with this, okay? So still waiting for a comprehensive plan. But I do believe that because it was such a public process, the public has a right to see these meetings. We shouldn't be sitting down hammering out potential annexation agreements with a landowner with this type of impact that they were so engaged in without the public being able to see them all. I just don't believe, I believe that there's little things that we meet with people on, and I'm not saying who the council can and cannot meet with. I'm not trying to dictate that, but I am saying that if we're seriously considering serious dating, everyone in this community has the right to hear those dates. Unfortunately, there's no quiet behind the scenes smooches on these kind of dates because that's not our job. Our job is to be transparent and let the public see what's going on. I have no problem with scheduling a special work meeting. If the team wants to come in, the development team wants to come in and meet with us, let the public have it on display, sit down and throw out what you're thinking. So everyone understands what's going on, because I have zero desire to have these conversations sitting at a lunch table or a dinner table with the other side of the table. I just don't believe that's the correct way to do this.
And Sherry, I'll tell you, that is the exact discussion we had yesterday.
Good.
It really is the exact discussion that the only way, again, to do this, and again, if at the end of some dating or whatever, we decide to try and take that to the next step, the only way that's successful is by having it being as open of a process as we can throughout that and engage. And so literally that was, I think, the foundation
That
that
was the exact word we used again was,
transparency was used all
when we're
day
talking
long.
about pretty pictures and theoretical ideas, yeah, sit down, they bring stuff to staff or a couple council members and say, this is what we're thinking about doing. That's great. And those meetings are appropriate and beneficial and keep people informed of kind of general ideas. But in order to move this forward in a more meaningful way, I think it needs to be formal. I think it needs to be transparent. I think it needs to be all of the city involved and representing that openly to the public, not Clint and I, or David and I sitting down, having a breakfast meeting, looking at some pictures. That's not helpful to any of us. And so I would reiterate, I think there's ways to do that more publicly, but then we also have to understand there's a whole long process of evaluating an annexation application that involves, public disclosures, public meetings, protest periods, evaluations, Lieutenant Governor's office reviews, all these different things. So there is no path forward that is not completely transparent to the public.
Well,
So
and
any insinuation that there's an attempt to try and obfuscate from the public
Well,
is not.
I do
Sure.
believe that there always is that intent oftentimes there's that intent. That's why the phone calls come, hey, what about this? That's why this intent to say 2 on 2, let's see what you're thinking. There's always this feel process to say, I wonder what they'll think. I shared with you all another one that's more up the canyon over here. They wanted to annex that piece of property. Went and looked at it with them. What do you think? I think that'd be great. Acre lots in our city would be great, but you got to go through the process. As soon as you apply and start going through the process, I'll actively engage with you, with the residents, and we'll look at this and see if this really makes sense for our community. But that is why we have a process. And so we have to, I just think that to think that we haven't been engaged in this, I think that is unfair to think that the council hasn't been engaged in it. There's been nothing to be engaged in.
I don't, Sherry, if you're taking that statement. You're misunderstanding
No,
any
I'm
comment
saying-
that I know I'm making, and I didn't hear from Clint.
Right.
Is that that's not
Right.
that's not the ask. That's not the presentation here. The presentation is not that there hasn't been engagement, because to your point, there hasn't been anything to be engaged on.
We've been engaged
But-
in the fact that we've engaged the studies and tried to make sure that we understand on our side
Right.
what makes sense for us, because I think that that has to be negotiated. We have to, just because the county did that, it's like, the county, sorry, different people at the county now, hallelujah, but they didn't.
But your
take
point,
into
that was my whole
consideration.
objection with going forward with the Bonneville study. The Bonneville study is an evaluation of what the county approved. It's not an evaluation of what we might negotiate to approve. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but we also have a comparison from the previous study. I think that it would be fairly easy to surmise the information that we need to out of those studies. And then we sit down and negotiate and figure out what's best. But always, I just think the public is such an important component of that, because they're very extremely loud about it. And if I'm gonna vote for something, I represent them. That is my
And
job
I
and my
think-
responsibility.
And I think that what Steve and I are both trying to say is that literally that was the discussion yesterday.
Good. So.
Is that was the discussion, is that in order for this to proceed, it has to be a public process. We have to be able to engage the public in every step. And we talked specifically about a joint meeting with the planning commission for them to come in and be able to give that overview so that everybody is on the same page. Those are the exact same things, because I think both Steve and I went in there yesterday with the understanding that we're done doing kind of that little dancing around that you're talking about. And that if we're going to be serious about this on both sides, then we need to take that next serious step and create a work group and create really a formalized public process to allow them to engage and allow us to do the digging in on our side that we need to do. Zoning, you're right, there's nothing that says that we have to accept that. But certainly, I think it's fair to say, based on our conversation yesterday, they certainly would like to see a zoning comparable to what they currently have that would help facilitate that. That's what we have to go through and decide if that's possible.
I agree.
And I want to be really clear about something too. This has to be a mutually beneficial, collaborative thing. This can't be, this is in no way a discussion about saying, what would the city have to do to convince Olympia Hills to be annexed? That's a terrible way to approach any negotiation. This has to be these are the things that Harriman City would need to see, and that's including financial analysis, planning, infrastructure. I mean, all of that stuff has to be evaluated, as well as developers saying, well, if we were going to annex, these are the things we would like to have. And we know that those aren't going to line up 100%. And there's going to be a process for trying to, see if we can bridge that gap.
Yeah.
I think that the effort from here up to a potential annexation application is simply to say, let's see how close we are.
So
Then let's make the application and get into it.
I have a few questions, if I may. I think I understand what you guys are proposing, but I admit to being confused because we've been excluded from all of these meetings. And I've brushed it off as they're just what you described, the pretty pictures and let me try to take you to breakfast. And I mean, my first year was like I thought it was normal because that's what I was told to do. And I realized that no, it's just a waste of time for most of those things. If that's all it's been, then great, more power to whoever wants to go do that. If we want to be serious and really evaluate it, then I agree. We need to do that. Both sides need to do that. So my question would be, what are the asks? There's been a lot of vague references,
I don't know.
but what are the asks?
Honestly, we didn't get into those asks because we needed to come to a consensus agreement that we were both agreeable on engaging that process collaboratively. They have not
Part
came.
of agreeing with that is laying out a process.
Right, and that's what we
does
talked
it
about
look
last
like?
time, is to say, look, we want legal to engage and see what kind, are they wanting us to use their agreement? Do they want a new agreement? What kind of engineering things would we need? What kind of infrastructure would make sense? There's no way that any kind of informal meeting could possibly address that. That can only be answered through formal discussions between city staff and representation of the developer to try and identify what those asks might even be.
So far, you're saying the developer hasn't indicated what they want.
Well, obviously, they're coming in, I guess that's probably not fair. They're coming in saying, this is what we obviously have approved. This is the starting point.
So that's what they're saying, is this what we want, can you do that? And the onus is on us to evaluate that piece by piece and say.
I guess in some ways, yes, they understand, they certainly
If that's
understand.
the case, that's fine, we
Yeah.
just need to know what we're dealing with.
I mean, obviously, you have it where you
I was
have,
under the impression that we had started that on our side earnestly by engaging in the studies, et cetera, so that we know what some of that looks like, and then we can progress from there. So are you saying we continue that part? Or are you saying we want to set up this study group and have the developer come in and actively participate with staff to
I think staff-
make it up as we go? I don't
I
understand.
think staff has to certainly be involved from the legal side, just like Steve said, from the legal side, from the
Well,
engineering
staff's fine,
side.
but I mean, you're wanting the developer to come in and participate in that rather than us if this is what they want, then it's us evaluating that.
Well, I guess I should probably clarify when I say, that's obviously their starting point, and it starts, obviously, one of the questions is zoning. We don't have a zone that matches. So I think they want to propose, or at least give us some zoning language to potentially look at and say, okay, is creating a new zone for us that's something that is feasible for us? Is it something that we would support as a council to create a similar
We've
zone?
already indicated those things, right? We've been working on that zone for a long, long time, wherever it fell off the drawing board. But I guess that's kind of my confusion is we've all been, to Sherry's point, we've all been engaged and willing to have these conversations and willing to do the work. We just can't do it open-ended like this forever. We need to know what we're working towards. We need to know step by step what we're evaluating.
Jared, I think the thing is, we need to go from being willing to do the work to start doing the work. That's what needs to happen.
That's
But
what, that's the
frankly-
frustration with annexation petitions. When a petition comes in, you know they're serious, but I don't want to have hours and hours and hours and hours of staff putting time and effort into this and have them go, okay, the other guys give us a better offer.
Yeah,
How
we kinda-
serious are they? How dedicated are they to, we want to spend our money as a city on our staff resources to do all this work and then have them be played?
Outside of Daybreak, it's probably the single largest development happening in the state of Utah.
Of course. We don't
It
talk
is
about how
1,000 acres
serious are they.
directly adjacent to us. It is a lot different than a 40-acre housing development.
How
It's a lot
serious
different
are
than a
they?
5-acre thing up in,
I know, Steve.
whatever the one's doing. This is something that is gonna take
I'm gonna
a huge amount of work to take a look at. I don't know.
David,
I-
can I say one last thing?
I will, just a second. Okay, I'm gonna need recommendations from the council members, so we do have to move in our general meeting, so I'd like to get your direction as we talk here about what you would like to do moving forward. So we'll start with Jared. What was your last comment, and if you give us your
Well,
recommendation?
I just want to understand clearly what's being proposed is what did you call it?
Work group.
A work group, but it sounded like you wanted the developer involved in that.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Absolutely.
So that I do have a little bit of concern with, because if they're saying this is what they want, then it's up to us to evaluate that piece by piece and go back through and say, well, we can create a zone that can accommodate a lot of these elements, right? Because the zone is general language, and we can do that. We were well down that path before. We need to evaluate it from an operational point of view, right? Do the roads make sense? Can we, one, put in all the infrastructure and then continue to provide the service for all those? And does it provide the quality of life for our residents? Like that's on us to do. And if they're saying this is the ask, then we have to go through that. And if we want to do it a piece at a time, right? And say, well, water, this is how water could work for this and what it would look like. Yeah, we could probably do that part, or no, we couldn't. It would have to be adjusted this way, right? And then we move to traffic and then move to this and pick it apart. That's on us to do. That's, to me, that makes sense for us to engage in a work group and give staff clear direction on something to work towards. But when you bring the developer into that part of it, then it is an active negotiation all the way through, and you're making up the rules as we go instead of evaluating, essentially, this is the application. right?
Mayor, if I
To
can-
Sherry's point.
If I can, I think I can simplify that a little bit for you. Because to your point, it has to be both of those things at the same time. Really, the components, Chase, correct me if I'm wrong, that were really kind of identified in terms of leading up to the submittal of an annexation petition would be zoning, a development agreement, financial analysis. I feel like I'm missing one.
Design standards.
Science standards.
Design standards, thank you. Those are really the things that they said, based on what they have approval for and what they want to build out there, those are the things that are of, I guess, concern to them in, maybe concern isn't the right word. Those are things that they need answers to questions to know, again, if they submit an annexation petition based on the feedback that we give them. So yes, we got to evaluate their plan, but there's information from them that I think our staff and us need through that process. And there is some negotiation in there that has to happen to come up with what that is moving forward, because it is outside of some of the scope of the things that we've done so far.
Yeah,
But
I think
there's
to
a
simplify it
big
even more
difference.
beyond that is, Chase, a few meetings ago, outlined a timeline under which an annexation
I saw.
kind of series of things would go. The reality is, the timeline for Olympia Hills to submit an annexation request is fast approaching. I mean, what is it, maybe mid-June or something like that? If they wanted to get it done in
I'll
this
go out on a limb
calendar
right
year.
now and say if they want a January date, if that's what they're asking you
Yeah,
in these
yeah,
meetings,
July
is can we get it annexed by January 1st? Like, that's pretty tough.
Because they have to have everything by July 1st to have it active by January.
October 31st is the deadline.
October 31st.
But there's a huge difference. I mean, think of how we conduct business, at least how I do in regular business. When you're and this is just me as a planner, I guess, when you're planning, I ask the other party a lot of questions. If I'm putting the plan together, if I'm analyzing it to see if it's going to work, I have to ask them a lot of questions, right? I get raw data and I have to ask them questions. That's a lot different from negotiating and making something up as we go, right? We have to have something clear to go on, not say we're going to sit down at the table and negotiate. That has never worked well. That's why our development agreements are terrible.
But Jared, do you understand that point is, you're saying, come to us, tell us what you want. This is what they want.
So
No,
let's-
we don't want that. So they
That's-
come back and then they
no,
bring something else and we go,
Steve.
no, I don't want that either. And then they come
You-
back
you
and
totally
it's a
missed what I
one-sided discussion that doesn't advance any
You
kind
totally
of
missed what I was saying.
understanding.
I agree with the concept of having a work group, right? But it needs to be structured and organized so that we break this down into piecemeal parts. You're saying that what's important to them is zoning, development agreement, design standards, and financial analysis. Zoning, zoning and design standards, I'd say, that should be fairly easy for us to work through, the legal side and our planning commission. This is how we would like that to look, and then bring them in. They should have their own, right? In the past, they've had their own attorneys draft it for us, right? And we've been looking at what they've brought to us, but we can create this and ask them those questions, incorporate things into that, right? That should be a process, picking one thing off at a time. Zoning, design standards, I don't think those things are a big issue, right? Development agreement is, because there's a lot of unknowns, right? And that's where they always ask for us to sign in blood and give them everything, right? Whether it's this developer or any others, they want everything, and we don't know what we don't know, and we've learned a lot of hard lessons that way. Our predecessors have, right? We've learned from them. Financial analysis isn't just a financial analysis. That's where it's the infrastructure. At least for me personally, what I care about is the infrastructure. Can we actually, one, put it in, and then two, support it? And this is the hard part, is does that support the quality of life that we're working for our residents? When I talk to my constituents, like, that's what they care about. How much longer, if it's going to be fewer roads and more people, that's opposite of what I want you to do for me, Jared, right? If it's going to be a lot more amenities, but my taxes are going to double, that's not what I'm looking for either. So,
To this specific question, is it your direction to staff that we do not do a working group?
I think if we're going to do that, we need to spell out at the beginning, this is what it looks like and what it needs to do and in what order, and have some direction to it. Like, we all need to know what that is rather than just saying, yeah,
So
let this group go sit down at the table and hash
As
it
of
out.
right now, your recommendation to staff is that we're not ready to take that step. Is that what you're
No,
saying?
that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying if we do that, we need to structure it properly. I'm not, if you're asking, do we give them direction right now? Yeah, go put a group together and come back to us.
That is the question I'm asking. 'cause
No,
that's the
I don't like
request
that idea.
That's the request that's been made, so that's the question.
No, I don't like that idea at all, to just put a group together and go figure it out. No.
Sharon, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I feel the same. I am, I 100% am open to any of this discussion, but I think that we have to have discussion. And I need to know there's skin in the game, because it's a lot of resource for us to do this if they're not serious about coming into Harriman. So are they seriously wanting to come into Harriman? And if so, is this seriously what they want?
I don't know how to describe it other than it appears that they very much are asking us to seriously work on it. I mean, this wasn't just, hey, I or Clint think maybe we should do this. The developer was a part of that meeting. They want to be involved in these discussions. They're saying, we want to have a discussion with you about a possible annexation.
So
That's literally where it is.
I agree, they have to do the hard work.
Back to
We
Sherry.
need to, but we need to
What was
structure.
your
May I suggest, Mayor, because there are some other things I wanted to talk about under this title of annexation. We have other lands that I would hope that we would be talking about under this heading. So can we just resume this conversation after the regular meeting, because we obviously have to come in to work.
I would like to get this particular, I'm happy to continue the item, but I'd like to get the question that's been posed by these council members resolved first. So in the request that was made, in regards to a working group, as the request was made, what was your direction to staff?
Yeah, I'd have to, I think as a council, we have to participate and form that working group. I think there has to be at least another meeting amongst us before.
So right now, your
No,
direction.
I don't think we're quite ready for that.
Clint, what is your recommendation to staff in regards to a working group?
So my recommendation is, yes, we form a working group.
Okay.
And just one quick comment to that. To your point, Sherry, I think, yes, it's absolutely going to take time and resources. There's no doubt about it. But I think we owe it to our residents and to the request of the developer to put in that. During an annexation process, they have an off-ramp that they can take and pull the plug all along the way. And that's with any annexation, and that's going to be the same thing here. But I think in order,
Us too.
yeah, us too.
That's why it's
But I
really-
think in order to answer the questions, we have to start somewhere, and I fully support a working group with staff to work on that.
I appreciate that. Steve, what is your recommendation to staff?
Yeah, I really think we have to do this in an organized way. And
I agree.
I don't know how I don't know what that exactly entails, but the concept of forming a more formal group that involves staff, council, planning commission, legal, engineering, also, I think we need to structure that and move that forward.
So that's your recommendation to staff, is that we move forward? Okay.
What he's asking is, are you giving direction to just form a group and go, or what we're saying is, let's us talk some more and organize that, and organize that before we just say go
And I
do
think
it.
that was clear when I was asking them. I think they understood that question. So with that being said, since it's 2 and 2 on both sides, I would be the deciding vote on that one. My direction to staff is that we do start a working group. So what that means is we have, under the 3 that we have, that the direction from the council is that we start a working group to start working with these things with the developers, to start figuring out if and what we need to do to make an annexation
That is
occur.
so vague and unclear. What is a working
Yeah.
group? That's all I'm saying, is I think we need to discuss
Let's
that,
organize
what
it.
a working
We
group
agree. Let's
is.
make a
Agree
group.
and try and figure it
Well,
out.
let's
That's what I'm
do it the
saying.
right way.
I guess I'm not
No,
understanding.
guys, at this point,
I'm saying we should organize a working group.
direction has been
You're
made.
saying we should organize a working
Steve.
group. Isn't that an
Steve.
He's
agreement?
asking
Steve.
if staff should go do it themselves instead of
The
us.
direction has been given to staff at this point, and the
what
direction
he's
been given. So at this point, we do need to move into our general meeting. So I'm going to ask for a motion to temporarily recess our work meeting so we can go into our general meeting.
Can I amend that motion with a tabling of item number 2.3 until we resume our meeting?
I think if we, I think.
Because I think
Jack,
to Sherry's question, she wanted to talk about other areas of annexation.
I don't think that precludes us from moving on from that item. I haven't finished that item yet, so we're still good, so.
Okay.
So, all in favor? Aye. Okay, ready to go upstairs. Thank you.